So in the last video, I had mentioned that I bought a lens so that I could take it with me on an adventure that Kat and I had planned. But it turns out that there was no professional photography or video allowed there. So that didn't work out. But I did grab a few sneaky shots with my phone, and I want to throw them up because it is really dope. Now, where I wanted to take you guys was called Arena Berlin, and it is an event space that has a bar, a man-made beach, a lounge, restaurant. But the main feature is the floating pool that sits in the middle of the main river, the Spree, here in Berlin. And it's super dope. They play awesome music. You can lounge around, have some afternoon aperitivos. And it was really fun. I was really hoping to use that lens and show you how it fixes the biggest flaw on this camera, the A7 IV. Now, since I wasn't able to film there, I decided to wake up early this morning and head down to one of my favorite spots. And I would test the lens out here so you guys can take a look at some of that footage. To give you a little backstory, when the A7 IV came out, people were mad. And to explain that, I think we have to go back even a little bit further. Right before the launch of the A7 IV, the A7S3 came out, and it is a much more professional camera loaded with more professional features. So I think there were some expectations that the A7 IV was not going to have some of those features, but there were some expectations of some features that I think people wanted it to have or expected it to have. And that main feature that I'm talking about, and I think a lot of you already know, is the 4K 60. And even though the camera does have it, Sony gave it a crop, a 1.5 times crop, and that just pissed everybody off. Now, personally, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but using the camera now since December, I have noticed in certain situations where I've wanted to get more of a slow-mo style shot, it made it a little bit more challenging. Now, if you look at behind me here, I'm using the 20mm G right now, and from where I'm standing, you can get the whole building in frame. And so if you want to do like a slow push-in shot that isn't slow-mo, you can get that. And if you have steady hands, that should be fine. But the second you switch it over to 4K 60, that changes. So I'm going to do that right now. And suddenly you lose the top of the building. And if you go to push in, you kind of don't get this really wide, epic field of view. So with that being said, this is the reason why this little tiny Sony 11mm made for the APS-C solves the A7 IV's biggest flaw. And if you're not familiar with the difference between the full frame sensor and what the crop means, essentially it just punches in 1.5 times to the center frame, making the sensor an APS-C, or sometimes in cinema they refer to it as Super 35. And since this little lens is designed for that, it will still give you that nice wide field of view. Now, the 11mm translates to 16.5 millimeters in 35mm equivalent. There is other full frame lenses that are pretty wide. There's the 12 to 24 and the 14 for full frame. But again, when you put those lenses on this camera and switch it to 4K 60, it'll punch in 1.5 times. So they are no longer 12 or 14. They're going to be closer to 18 and 19 or whatever that is. Whatever the math is, 1.5 times. So this lens and the other new Sony lens, the 10 to 20, will give you the closest thing to the 16 or 15 to 35, something around there. So let's swap the lens out, put the 11mm on, and everything you're seeing after this will be from the Sony A7 IV in 4K 60. So there you go. now we are on the 11mm 1.8, and as you can see, the frame is already much wider than even the 20. And even if I put on active stabilization, I think it'll just crop in a very tiny bit more. So I'm in the exact same spot. I want to flip the camera around and show you how much more of the building you can get in at 4K 60. And there you go. The exact same spot on 4K 60, and now you get the whole building in frame. And I actually have active stabilization on right now. Let me turn that off and see what that looks like. There you go. Now it's even a little bit wider still. So you can push in and you'll be all good. Now, normally I use active stabilization because it's a lot smoother, but it does punch it on the 20 quite a bit. And I use that when I'm doing these nice slow walks or slow push-ins. And I do that on 4K 24 because the active stabilization really helps smooth it out. But because now on 4K 60, it's going to be smoothed out anyways. So I can keep it on standard stabilization and I don't have to worry about too many of the micro jitters when I slow it down to 40% in the timeline. So let's go out and get some test shots so you can see if you like this lens or not, the quality of the shots. And as I mentioned before in the first impressions video, I think it's gonna be pretty good. Even though I mentioned that standard stabilization is probably going to be good enough, especially since 4K 60 footage is going to be slowed down, I'm still curious how active stabilization is going to do. So right now we're in this really cool spot, and what I want to do is push through these pillars and reveal the Alex Tower behind this horseman fighting this lion. And we're going to start in the same spot right here. And we're going to do a slow push-in using standard stabilization first and then active and see if it even makes a difference. I have to say, in the back monitor, the active stabilization just looks so much smoother. But again, it hasn't been slowed down yet. So you tell me in the comments, which one did you like better? The assumingly smoother one with active, or standard stabilization but a wider field of view, and if the stabilization was good enough on that one. Let's just grab a couple more shots and then I'll give you my final thoughts. Alright, so what do I think? I think for $599, this lens is an amazing addition to your kit if you own the A7 IV. Now, there are other lenses that can sort of do the same thing. The top one being the Laowa 9mm, and that is a 2.8. It's also a manual lens. I considered that lens, And I was seriously thinking about buying it until this one was announced. And the reason why I bought this is because of the native autofocus. And for the way I shoot, I think that is invaluable, and I was willing to give up the extra 2mm. Now, the 1.8 on this is so much more advantageous than the other lens that Sony announced, which is the 10-20, because that is only an f4. And if you're buying a lens like this, you're most likely shooting interiors or architecture or real estate. And so when the light is low, the 1.8 is going to come in super clutch. So in terms of the image quality, I was super happy with the video coming out of this lens. It did everything that I had hoped it would do, is these wide landscape and establishing style shots that I couldn't really get before. The lens is nice and light, which is really awesome if you need to travel or just throw into your bag. It doesn't take up a lot of space, not a lot of weight, but it does have a little bit of wobble if you were gonna hand hold it, because it is so light. And in order to get really steady handheld shots, I think you need a little bit of weight. And so as you could see in some of the shots, when I was using standard stabilization, you could still see my footsteps. So for me, I think the active stabilization is still the way to go with this lens, as you had seen in that side-by-side comparison. I thought when the active was on, the image was beautiful. But I want to know what you think. Did you like the images coming out of this lens? Are you going to buy this lens? Do you think it's worth it? And do you think it fixes the A7 IV? Not that I think anything is wrong with it anyways. I'm just being super facetious. I think the crop is totally fine, and in some cases I found it actually advantageous for a little bit of extra reach. But that's pretty much it for me. Thank you for watching. Catherine and I are off on a little adventure this weekend, a real adventure this time, out of the city. We were checking out some castles in a very old town in Germany. So subscribe to see that, and we'll see you in the next one. As always, live passionately and stay inspired. Bye.